Allow me to introduce myself. I am Lady Vesper Ashford, last season's debutante, the jewel of the court, and the orchestrator of the downfall of four of England's most powerful men. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I prefer mine with champagne and a delicate smile. I danced in ballrooms, laughed through Hyde Park mornings, and toppled dynasties with the same quiet grace with which one serves tea. Some call it betrayal. I call it justice. Now sit back, dear viewer, and learn how to dismantle an empire with secrets, charm, and absolute precision. England in 1815 was a realm where power flowed through bloodlines like rivers through ancient channels, carving deep grooves in the landscape of society that would endure for generations. The Regency period had crystallized into a magnificent theater of protocol, where every gesture carried the weight of centuries, every word was measured against the golden scales of propriety, and every silence held more meaning than 1,000 declarations. Within the marble halls of Ravenscroft Manor, nestled in the rolling hills of Derbyshire, the morning light filtered through towering Georgian windows, casting elongated shadows across Persian carpets that had witnessed 3 generations of whispered conspiracies and sealed fates. The manor stood as a testament to the Ashford family legacy, its limestone facade weathered by English rains but its foundations unshakable, much like the dynasty it housed. Lady Vesper Ashford moved through these hallowed corridors with the fluid grace of someone born to command attention, yet trained to deflect it when necessary. At 22 years of age, she possessed the kind of beauty that painters struggled to capture and poets failed to adequately describe. Her raven-black hair was arranged in the fashionable style of the day, swept up in an elaborate chignon that revealed the elegant curve of her neck, adorned with a simple strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. Her eyes, the color of storm clouds gathering over the moors, held depths that suggested intelligence far beyond her years and secrets that would have scandalized the finest drawing rooms in London. The Ashford name carried weight in the highest circles of English society. Her father, the Duke of Ravenscroft, commanded respect from Westminster to the royal court, his influence extending through carefully cultivated relationships with peers whose titles stretched back to the Norman conquest. The family fortune, built upon vast estates, profitable investments in the East India Company, and strategic marriages spanning 3 centuries, seemed as eternal as the limestone cliffs of Dover. This particular morning found Lady Vesper in the morning room, a chamber decorated in shades of cream and gold, where delicate Wedgwood china rested upon mahogany surfaces polished to mirror brightness. She wore a morning dress of the finest Indian muslin, its empire waist accentuating her graceful figure, while the long sleeves and modest neckline maintained the strict standards of propriety expected of an unmarried lady of her station. The dress had been fashioned by the most sought-after modiste in London, its simplicity speaking to a sophistication that required no ornamentation to make its statement. The Duke himself was a formidable figure, standing well over 6 feet in height, his broad shoulders filling his impeccably tailored morning coat of deep blue superfine wool. His graying hair was styled in the mathematical precision demanded by his valet, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing as they surveyed his domain. At 53 years of age, he retained the bearing of a man who had never encountered a challenge he could not overcome through sheer force of will, wealth, or strategic maneuvering. Their morning ritual unfolded with clockwork precision. The Duke would enter the morning room at precisely 8:30, having already spent 2 hours in his study reviewing correspondence from his steward, his man of business, and various political allies. Lady Vesper would be waiting, having dismissed her ladies' maid only moments before, creating the illusion of casual domesticity while maintaining the careful choreography that governed their interactions. The social season was approaching its height, and with it came the endless rounds of obligations that defined their world. Almack's assembly rooms awaited with their Wednesday evening balls, where the patronesses wielded power more absolute than many crowned heads. The opera at Covent Garden offered opportunities for public display and private negotiation. Garden parties at Holland House provided neutral ground for political maneuvering disguised as social pleasure. Lady Vesper had been presented at court the previous season, making her curtsy to the Prince Regent with the perfect combination of deference and dignity that spoke to years of careful training. The presentation had been a triumph, her court dress of white silk and silver thread catching the light of 1,000 candles as she moved through the formal steps of presentation protocol. The feathers in her hair, the regulation 3 ostrich plumes required for court presentation, had been positioned with mathematical precision by her lady's maid, who had spent a full morning perfecting the arrangement. The marriage proposals had begun arriving within a fortnight of her presentation. Eldest sons of earls, younger sons of dukes, wealthy merchants seeking to buy their way into the nobility through advantageous marriages, they all recognized in Lady Vesper a prize worthy of their highest aspirations. Her dowry, substantial enough to restore the fortunes of even the most profligate nobleman, made her doubly desirable in a world where love was a luxury few could afford and fewer still dared to pursue. Yet Lady Vesper had deflected each proposal with the skill of a master fencer, never giving outright refusal that might cause offense, never showing enough encouragement to raise hopes too high. Her father approved of this strategy, seeing in it the wisdom of a woman who understood that timing in the marriage market was everything. The right alliance, struck at the perfect moment, could elevate the Ashford influence to unprecedented heights. The household staff moved through their duties with the precision of a military operation. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, had served the family for 30 years, her starched apron and rigid posture embodying the disciplined efficiency that kept Ravenscroft Manor functioning like the finest clockwork. The butler, Thornton, commanded the male servants with quiet authority, his evening coat and white gloves as immaculate at midnight as they were at dawn. Below stairs, the kitchen buzzed with preparation for the day's meals, each dish planned according to strict protocols of seasonal availability, nutritional balance, and social significance. The French chef, imported at considerable expense from Paris, commanded his domain with artistic temperament and culinary genius, creating meals that served as both sustenance and statement of the family's refined tastes. The stables housed bloodstock that was the envy of the county, each horse bred for specific purposes, from the matched greys that drew Lady Vesper's barouche for afternoon calls to the powerful hunters that carried the Duke through the demanding terrain of the fox hunt. The head groom, a man whose knowledge of horseflesh was legendary throughout the Midlands, oversaw this equine empire with devotion that bordered on the religious. In the gardens, landscapes designed by Capability Brown himself provided a living artwork that changed with the seasons while maintaining eternal principles of proportion and harmony. Ancient oaks provided shade for intimate conversations, while carefully planned vistas offered views that seemed to stretch into infinity, creating the illusion that the Ashford domain extended beyond the horizon itself. The library contained first editions that scholars traveled from Edinburgh and Cambridge to consult, its leather-bound volumes representing centuries of accumulated wisdom. Lady Vesper spent hours among these treasures, her education having extended far beyond the ornamental accomplishments deemed sufficient for most young ladies of her station. She read Latin and French with fluency, understood enough Greek to appreciate classical texts in their original form, and possessed a mathematical mind that could calculate compound interest faster than most men of business. This morning, however, something in the air felt different. Perhaps it was the way her father's usual confident stride seemed slightly less certain, or the manner in which his penetrating gaze avoided her eyes for the first time in her memory. The Duke's morning correspondence lay unopened beside his untouched breakfast, a breach of routine so unprecedented that Lady Vesper felt the first stirrings of unease. The silence between them stretched beyond the comfortable familiarity of daily routine into something more ominous. Lady Vesper's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her teacup, the delicate spode china warming her palms as she waited for whatever revelation this morning might bring. Outside the tall windows, storm clouds gathered over the Derbyshire hills, their dark masses promising change to come. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation or tearful confession, but through the mundane accident of a misplaced letter discovered in her mother's former writing desk. Lady Vesper had descended to the morning room earlier than usual, seeking solitude before the day's obligations began their relentless march through her carefully scheduled existence. The writing desk, an exquisite piece of Sheraton furniture inlaid with satinwood and rosewood, had remained undisturbed since her mother's death 7 years prior, serving more as shrine than functional furniture. Lady Vesper's mother, the late Duchess of Ravenscroft, had been renowned throughout English society for her beauty, intelligence, and charitable works. Eleanor Montague had married the Duke in what was celebrated as a love match, rare among their circle where marriages were typically strategic alliances disguised as romantic attachments. Their courtship had been the stuff of legend, chronicled in the society papers and whispered about in drawing rooms from London to Edinburgh. The letter, written in her mother's distinctive handwriting with its elegant flourishes and perfectly formed letters, had been tucked behind a hidden panel that Lady Vesper discovered purely by chance when the desk drawer stuck and required force to open. The paper bore the Ashford crest, its quality speaking to the family's wealth and status, but the words it contained shattered every assumption Lady Vesper had held about her family's honor and her father's character. As she read, the morning light streaming through the Georgian windows seemed to dim, and the familiar surroundings of the morning room transformed into something alien and threatening. Her mother's words, written in obvious distress, revealed a truth so devastating that Lady Vesper found herself gripping the edge of the desk to maintain her composure. The letter detailed how the Duke had systematically destroyed Eleanor's first marriage to Lord James Whitmore, a union that had been both a love match and politically advantageous to families other than the Ashfords. Through carefully orchestrated rumors, forged documents, and strategic manipulation of social pressures, the Duke had engineered the annulment of Eleanor's first marriage, leaving her reputation in tatters and her first husband's family financially ruined. But the depths of the Duke's machinations went far beyond simple marriage manipulation. The letter revealed how he had used Eleanor's desperation and social isolation to coerce her into marriage, threatening to completely destroy what remained of her reputation if she refused his advances. More shocking still were the details of how he had continued to control and manipulate her throughout their marriage, using her love for the daughter they would have together as leverage to ensure her compliance with his increasingly outrageous demands. The letter spoke of other women, wives of the Duke's political rivals and business associates, who had suffered similar fates. Lady Catherine Pembroke, whose husband had opposed one of the Duke's bills in Parliament, had found herself the victim of a whisper campaign so vicious that she had retreated to the continent in shame. Lady Margaret Sinclair, whose family's shipping interests competed with Ashford investments, had been maneuvered into a compromising position that forced her husband to withdraw from several lucrative contracts. Most horrifying of all was Eleanor's description of Lady Isabella Thornfield, a young woman who had refused the Duke's advances during Eleanor's engagement period. The Duke had orchestrated a scandal so devastating that Lady Isabella had taken her own life rather than face the social ostracism that would have followed. Her death had been attributed to a riding accident, but Eleanor's letter revealed the truth of her suicide and the Duke's role in driving her to such desperation. As Lady Vesper continued reading, her mother's handwriting became increasingly erratic, reflecting the emotional turmoil of the revelations she was documenting. Eleanor had discovered that the Duke's wealth and influence were built not merely on inherited advantages and sound business practices, but on a systematic campaign of blackmail, manipulation, and social destruction that had lasted for decades. The Duke maintained detailed files on the secrets and vulnerabilities of every important family in English society. He knew which lords were deeply in debt to moneylenders, which ladies had engaged in indiscreet correspondences, which gentlemen had bastard children hidden away in the countryside. This information became currency in his hands, traded for political support, business advantages, and social compliance. Eleanor's letter revealed that she had attempted to gather evidence of her husband's crimes, hoping to find some way to expose his corruption without destroying their daughter's future. But the Duke's network of informants and allies was too extensive, his control too complete. Every attempt Eleanor made to reach out for help was reported back to him within hours, leading to increasingly severe restrictions on her movements and activities. The final pages of the letter detailed Eleanor's growing despair as she realized the full extent of her husband's evil and her own powerlessness to stop it. She had considered leaving him, but knew that he would use his influence to ensure she never saw her daughter again. She had thought of exposing him publicly, but understood that his control over the social and political machinery of England was so complete that any accusations would be turned back upon her, painting her as a mad woman whose grief had driven her to make false accusations against a respected peer of the realm. The letter concluded with Eleanor's desperate hope that someday, when Lady Vesper was old enough to understand and strong enough to act, she would find these words and use them to bring justice to the women her father had destroyed. Eleanor had hidden copies of documents, testimony from servants, and other evidence throughout the house, creating a trail of proof that could expose the Duke's crimes if assembled by someone with the intelligence and determination to see the task through to completion. Lady Vesper sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the letter trembling in her hands as the full implications of her mother's revelations sank into her consciousness. Everything she had believed about her family, her father, and her own position in society had been built upon a foundation of lies, manipulation, and the systematic destruction of innocent women. The sounds of the house awakening around her seemed to come from a great distance. Servants moved through their morning routines, preparing for another day in the life of one of England's most respected noble families, unaware that the young woman sitting in the morning room was experiencing a transformation that would ultimately bring their carefully ordered world crashing down around them. Lady Vesper's hands shook as she carefully folded the letter and secured it within the bodice of her morning dress. Her mother's words had given her more than just knowledge of past crimes. They had provided her with a mission that would consume every aspect of her existence from this moment forward. The Duke's victims had been helpless individual women, isolated and vulnerable to his manipulations. But his daughter would be different. She possessed advantages that Eleanor and the others had lacked. She had been raised within the system that had destroyed them, educated in its methods and given access to its inner workings. She understood the language of power, the currency of influence, and the carefully maintained network of obligations and dependencies that held English high society together. Most importantly, she had inherited her father's intelligence and strategic thinking, gifts that she would now turn against their original possessor. As Lady Vesper rose from the writing desk, her reflection in the morning room's mirror showed a young woman whose appearance remained unchanged, but whose eyes now held a depth of purpose that had not been there an hour before. The season's social obligations, the marriage proposals, the endless round of balls and dinner parties, all of these would now serve a purpose far different from what her father intended. The Duke of Ravenscroft had spent decades building his empire of fear and manipulation, confident that his position was unassailable and his methods too subtle for detection. He had never considered that his greatest creation, the daughter he had raised to be the crown jewel of his dynasty, might become the instrument of his destruction. Lady Vesper smoothed her morning dress, checked her reflection once more, and prepared to join her father for breakfast. When she entered the dining room, her smile would be as warm and daughterly as always, her conversation as pleasant and appropriate as he had trained her to make it. But behind that perfectly maintained facade, a plan was already taking shape that would make Eleanor's wildest dreams of justice seem modest by comparison. The war between father and daughter had begun, though only one of them knew it. The London season of 1815 opened with unprecedented brilliance, the victory at Waterloo having infused English society with a confidence and exuberance that manifested in increasingly lavish entertainments and ever more complex social maneuvering. Lady Vesper arrived in the capital as the perfect embodiment of aristocratic femininity, her wardrobe a carefully curated collection of the finest fashions available, each gown designed to enhance her natural beauty while maintaining the strict standards of propriety expected of an unmarried lady of her elevated station. The Ashford townhouse in Mayfair stood as a monument to generations of accumulated wealth and refined taste, its Adam architecture representing the pinnacle of elegant urban living. The drawing rooms were decorated in the latest style, with silk wallpapers from France, furniture by the most celebrated craftsmen, and artwork that included pieces by Reynolds and Gainsborough. Every detail had been selected to reinforce the family's position at the apex of English society. Lady Vesper's first target was Lord Pemberton, the Earl of Westbrook, a man whose political influence rivaled that of her own father, and whose personal conduct had long been whispered about in the darker corners of fashionable society. Pemberton was known for his particular interest in young women making their debuts, his patronage often extending beyond appropriate boundaries into territory that more observant mothers quietly steered their daughters away from. The Earl was a man of imposing physical presence, standing well over 6 feet in height, with a kind of distinguished silver hair and commanding bearing that made him a favorite subject for portrait painters. His fortune was enormous, built upon coal mines in the north of England and strategic investments in the growing railway companies. At 58 years of age, he had buried 2 wives and shown no inclination toward a third marriage, preferring the freedom that widowerhood afforded him to pursue his various interests without the constraints of domestic obligations. Lady Vesper's approach to Lord Pemberton was a masterpiece of subtle manipulation disguised as innocent social interaction. She had studied his habits, his preferences, his vulnerabilities with the thoroughness of a military strategist preparing for battle. She knew that he frequented certain gaming hells where the stakes were high and the company questionable. She understood his weakness for French wine and Italian opera singers. Most importantly, she had discovered his involvement in a shipping venture that employed practices which, while not technically illegal, would cause enormous scandal if brought to public attention. Their first meaningful encounter occurred at Lady Melbourne's soirée, an event that drew the most influential members of London society to witness performances by celebrated musicians and engage in the kind of elevated conversation that defined intellectual sophistication. Lady Vesper positioned herself near the pianoforte where a renowned Italian soprano was performing arias from the latest operas, knowing that Lord Pemberton's appreciation for musical excellence would draw him to that particular location. When the Earl approached, Lady Vesper acknowledged his presence with exactly the right degree of deference mixed with confidence, neither too eager nor too distant. Her conversation revealed an unexpected depth of knowledge about opera and musical composition, interests that were unusual among young ladies of her generation, and therefore intriguing to a man who prided himself on intellectual superiority. Over the course of several subsequent social encounters, Lady Vesper carefully cultivated Lord Pemberton's interest, allowing him to believe that he was the pursuer while she maintained control over every aspect of their interaction. She demonstrated remarkable talent for drawing him into conversations about his business interests, expressing fascination with the complex financial arrangements that governed international shipping and trade. The Earl, flattered by the attention of such an accomplished and beautiful young woman, began to share details about his various enterprises, including the shipping venture that employed questionable labor practices. Lady Vesper listened with rapt attention, asking intelligent questions that encouraged him to reveal more than prudence would normally allow. Her memory was extraordinary, and she retained every detail of information that might prove useful in the future. Simultaneously, Lady Vesper began cultivating relationships with other members of London society who might serve her ultimate purposes. Lady Catherine Morland, whose husband served in the diplomatic corps and therefore had access to sensitive information about international affairs, became a frequent companion at morning calls and afternoon shopping expeditions. Through careful questioning disguised as idle curiosity, Lady Vesper learned about potential conflicts between British trading interests and foreign governments that could affect Lord Pemberton's shipping investments. Lord Fitzwilliam, a young man whose family owned newspapers and who possessed genuine affection for Lady Vesper, provided another avenue for gathering and disseminating information. His romantic interest in her gave Lady Vesper influence over editorial decisions and access to printing capabilities that would prove invaluable when the time came to expose Lord Pemberton's activities. The social season progressed with its familiar rhythm of morning calls, afternoon rides in Hyde Park, evening entertainments at various great houses, and the twice-weekly assemblies at Almack's that served as unofficial tribunals where reputations were made and destroyed. Lady Vesper participated in all of these activities with apparent enthusiasm, her behavior never deviating from the expected patterns of a well-bred young lady enjoying her second season in society. Yet beneath this conventional surface, she was methodically gathering intelligence, building alliances, and positioning herself for the systematic destruction of the men who had contributed to her mother's suffering. Each conversation was carefully planned, each social encounter calculated to advance her ultimate objectives. She was learning to weaponize charm, to transform her beauty and intelligence into tools of manipulation that would rival anything her father had ever employed. The breakthrough in her campaign against Lord Pemberton came through an unexpected source. One of his former mistresses, a woman who had been discarded when her demands for financial support became inconvenient, approached Lady Vesper at a musicale with information about the Earl's private papers. The woman, driven by her own desire for revenge, offered to provide access to documents that would expose not only the shipping scandal but also evidence of other activities that would destroy Pemberton's reputation permanently. Lady Vesper received this intelligence with carefully maintained composure, neither showing excessive interest nor appearing indifferent to the woman's offer. She understood that desperate people often made unreliable allies, but she also recognized that the information being offered was exactly what she needed to complete her first act of revenge. The plan that emerged from these various threads of information and opportunity was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential consequences. Lady Vesper would use her access to Lord Pemberton to obtain additional confirmation of his questionable business practices. She would then coordinate the release of this information through multiple channels simultaneously, ensuring that the scandal could not be contained or dismissed as the fabrication of a single enemy. Lord Fitzwilliam's newspapers would carry detailed exposés of the shipping practices, complete with documentation and witness testimony. Anonymous letters would be sent to other influential families whose members served on various charitable boards with Lord Pemberton, informing them of activities that would make continued association impossible. Most devastatingly, carefully selected members of Parliament would receive information about potential connections between Pemberton's business interests and foreign governments that might be considered treasonous under certain interpretations of English law. The timing of this coordinated attack was crucial. Lady Vesper chose to act during the height of the social season, when Lord Pemberton's prominence was at its peak and the potential for maximum humiliation was greatest. The revelations would break on a Wednesday, the day of the most important assembly at Almack's, ensuring that the news would spread throughout fashionable society with unprecedented speed. As the appointed day approached, Lady Vesper maintained her usual routine with mechanical precision, attending the expected social functions, engaging in appropriate conversations, giving no sign of the storm that was about to break over one of England's most powerful men. Her performance was so convincing that even her father, despite his experience in reading human nature and detecting deception, noticed nothing unusual in his daughter's behavior. The night before the scandal broke, Lady Vesper sat in her chamber in the Mayfair townhouse, writing in the private journal she had begun keeping since discovering her mother's letter. Her entries documented not only the progress of her various schemes but also her growing understanding of the psychology of manipulation and the mechanics of social destruction. She was learning to think like her father while maintaining the moral purpose that distinguished her actions from his purely selfish motivations. Tomorrow would bring the first fruits of her campaign for justice, but Lady Vesper understood that Lord Pemberton was merely the beginning. Her father's network of corruption extended throughout the highest levels of English society, and dismantling it would require patience, cunning, and a willingness to sacrifice her own reputation and prospects if necessary. She was prepared for all of these consequences, driven by a sense of purpose that made personal considerations seem trivial by comparison. The young woman who had discovered her mother's letter 3 months earlier had been transformed into something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The destruction of Lord Pemberton unfolded with the terrible beauty of a precisely executed military campaign, each revelation timed to maximum effect, each piece of evidence presented at the moment when it would cause the greatest damage to his reputation and position. The scandal broke on a Wednesday morning when the most influential members of London society discovered damning documents had been delivered to their breakfast tables alongside their usual correspondence, ensuring that the news would dominate conversation at every significant social gathering throughout the day. Lord Fitzwilliam's newspapers published detailed exposés that documented Pemberton's involvement in shipping ventures that employed child labor under conditions that shocked even the most hardened readers of scandal sheets. The articles included reproductions of contracts bearing his signature, testimony from former employees who had witnessed the conditions firsthand, and financial records that traced profits from these enterprises directly to his personal accounts. Simultaneously, members of Parliament received carefully compiled dossiers that revealed connections between Pemberton's business interests and foreign governments that were considered potentially hostile to British interests. While these connections were not technically treasonous, they were substantial enough to raise serious questions about his loyalty and judgment among men whose political futures depended upon maintaining unquestionable patriotic credentials. The social implications were even more devastating than the legal or political consequences. Lady Vesper had ensured that the wives of the most influential men in London society received detailed accounts of Pemberton's treatment of the women who had been involved with him over the years. These accounts, presented as confidential warnings between concerned ladies, painted a picture of systematic manipulation and cruelty that made continued association with the Earl impossible for anyone who valued their reputation. By midday, Lord Pemberton found himself facing a coordinated assault on every aspect of his public and private life. His political allies distanced themselves with unprecedented speed, citing urgent business that prevented them from attending meetings where his presence might prove embarrassing. His business partners announced reviews of their joint ventures, using language that clearly indicated their intention to dissolve all connections as quickly as legally possible. The social ostracism was even more complete. Invitations were quietly withdrawn, calling cards were returned unopened, and servants were instructed to inform visitors that their employers were not at home to callers associated with the disgraced Earl. The very efficiency of this social exile demonstrated the power of the network that Lady Vesper had assembled and deployed against her target. Lord Pemberton's attempts to defend himself only made his situation worse. His denials lacked credibility in the face of overwhelming documentary evidence, and his accusations of conspiracy seemed like the desperate fabrications of a man whose guilt had been conclusively established. Every statement he made was carefully dissected by hostile newspapers and used as further evidence of his moral corruption and dishonesty. The Duke of Ravenscroft observed his daughter's first triumph with a mixture of pride and growing unease that he could not entirely explain. Lady Vesper's involvement in the destruction of Lord Pemberton was not immediately obvious, but her father's experience in such matters made him sensitive to patterns and connections that others might miss. The precision of the attack, the coordination of multiple sources of pressure, the careful timing that maximized damage while minimizing the possibility of effective response, all of these elements bore the hallmarks of strategic thinking that reminded him uncomfortably of his own methods. Yet when he questioned Lady Vesper about her knowledge of the Pemberton affair, her responses seemed entirely appropriate for a young lady whose involvement in such matters should have been limited to shocked reaction and appropriate moral condemnation. She expressed surprise at the revelations, horror at the treatment of the women involved, and satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Her performance was so convincing that the Duke began to question his own suspicions. The success of the Pemberton campaign emboldened Lady Vesper to accelerate her timeline for the next phase of her revenge. Lord Marcus Thornfield, whose family's business interests had often competed with those of the Ashfords, became her second target. Thornfield was the younger brother of Lady Isabella, the woman whose suicide her mother's letter had attributed to the Duke's machinations, making his destruction particularly satisfying from the perspective of poetic justice. Lord Marcus was a more challenging target than Pemberton had been, primarily because his personal conduct was less obviously questionable and his business practices more carefully hidden behind layers of legal complexity. He was also younger, more physically attractive, and possessed of a charm that made him popular among both men and women of fashionable society. His reputation for honorable dealing in business matters and generous support of charitable causes created a protective barrier that would require more sophisticated methods to penetrate. Lady Vesper's approach to Lord Marcus involved a completely different strategy than she had employed against Pemberton. Rather than positioning herself as an interested observer of his activities, she presented herself as a potential romantic interest, using her beauty and intelligence to gain access to his private thoughts and confidential business information. This approach required her to walk a much more dangerous line between manipulation and genuine intimacy, testing her emotional discipline in ways that her previous campaign had not. The courtship between Lady Vesper and Lord Marcus became one of the most closely watched romantic developments of the season, not least because both parties were considered among the most desirable unmarried members of their respective social circles. Their interactions at various social events displayed exactly the right combination of attraction and propriety to fuel speculation while avoiding scandal, and their obvious intellectual compatibility suggested the possibility of a genuine love match rather than merely a strategic alliance. Behind this carefully maintained facade, Lady Vesper was systematically gathering intelligence about Lord Marcus's business dealings, family relationships, and personal vulnerabilities. She discovered that his financial position was less secure than public appearances suggested, with significant debts hidden behind complex accounting arrangements. More importantly, she learned that his business success had been built upon systematic manipulation of smaller competitors, forcing them into disadvantageous arrangements that enriched the Thornfield enterprises while driving their victims toward bankruptcy. The evidence Lady Vesper assembled against Lord Marcus revealed a pattern of predatory business practices that, while technically legal, violated every principle of honorable commercial conduct that gentlemen were expected to observe. His methods included spreading false rumors about competitors' financial stability, bribing suppliers to break contracts with rival firms, and using political connections to secure preferential treatment in government contracting that gave his companies unfair advantages over their competitors. Most damaging of all was Lady Vesper's discovery that Lord Marcus had been systematically cheating charitable organizations that had trusted him to manage their investments. His manipulations had diverted hundreds of thousands of pounds from institutions dedicated to helping orphans, widows, and other vulnerable members of society into his own accounts, while maintaining public records that concealed the extent of his embezzlement. The revelation of these crimes would require a more delicate approach than the Pemberton scandal had demanded, partly because Lord Marcus's victims were primarily institutions rather than individuals, and partly because the evidence was more complex and difficult for the general public to understand. Lady Vesper needed to find ways to make abstract financial crimes personally meaningful to the people whose opinions would determine Lord Marcus's fate in society. Her solution was to focus attention on specific examples of how Lord Marcus's embezzlement had affected real people. She identified orphans who had been denied education because funds intended for their schooling had been diverted to Thornfield investments. She found widows whose pensions had been reduced because charitable funds that should have supported them had been systematically plundered. She located veterans of the Napoleonic Wars whose medical care had been compromised because money designated for their treatment had been stolen by the man they had trusted to manage their welfare funds. The campaign against Lord Marcus launched on a Thursday evening during the intermission of a performance at Covent Garden Opera House, when carefully placed allies began circulating printed materials that documented his crimes with devastating specificity. The timing ensured that the most influential members of society would learn of the scandal simultaneously, preventing any possibility of managing the flow of information or controlling the narrative. The documents revealed not only the extent of Lord Marcus's embezzlement but also the methods he had used to conceal his crimes, including forgery of official records, bribery of clerks and accountants, and intimidation of potential witnesses. The evidence was presented with such overwhelming completeness that denial was impossible and defense futile. The social and professional consequences for Lord Marcus were even more severe than those that had befallen Lord Pemberton, partly because theft from charitable institutions was considered particularly heinous among people who prided themselves on their moral superiority and philanthropic generosity. His immediate expulsion from every charitable board and social organization was followed by formal investigations that would ultimately result in criminal charges and imprisonment. Lady Vesper observed the destruction of her second target with the cold satisfaction of someone who understood that justice delayed was not justice denied, merely justice refined into a more perfect instrument of retribution. Yet she also recognized that her successes were drawing attention from quarters where scrutiny might prove dangerous to her continued operations. The Duke of Ravenscroft was no longer merely suspicious. He was actively investigating the connections between his daughter and the scandals that were systematically destroying his allies and business associates. His own network of informants and investigators was beginning to piece together patterns that suggested coordination and planning beyond what coincidence could explain. The war between father and daughter was entering a new phase, one where stealth would give way to open conflict and where the stakes would become existential for both combatants. The drawing room of the Ashford townhouse had become a battlefield disguised as a domestic space, its elegant furnishings and carefully arranged artwork serving as silent witnesses to conversations that carried the weight of dynasties and the power to reshape the fundamental structures of English society. The Duke of Ravenscroft sat behind his massive mahogany desk, surrounded by documents that represented months of investigation into the systematic destruction of his allies, while Lady Vesper occupied the chair opposite him with the poised confidence of someone who had anticipated this confrontation and prepared for it with meticulous care. The evidence spread across the desk between them told a story of calculated revenge executed with surgical precision, each piece of documentation representing another thread in the web of connections that linked Lady Vesper to the scandals that had consumed Lords Pemberton and Marcus Thornfield. Bank records showed payments to the very informants who had provided the most damaging information about her targets. Correspondence revealed communications with newspaper editors whose timing of revelations had been too perfectly coordinated to be coincidental. Witness statements placed her in locations where crucial intelligence had been gathered at precisely the moments when such information would have been most valuable. The Duke's voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of the paternal warmth that had characterized their previous interactions, replaced instead by the cold authority of a man who had spent decades manipulating others and recognized the techniques when they were employed against him. His analysis of Lady Vesper's campaign demonstrated a thorough understanding of her methods and ungrudging respect for the sophistication of her planning, even as he condemned the betrayal that her actions represented. Lady Vesper listened to her father's accusations with the calm attention of someone receiving a professional evaluation rather than a personal attack, her composure remaining perfect even as he detailed the extent of his knowledge about her activities. When he finished speaking, She reached into her reticule and withdrew a leather portfolio that contained documents whose significance became immediately apparent from the Duke's reaction. The portfolio held copies of her mother's letter, along with additional evidence that Eleanor had hidden throughout Ravenscroft Manor and the London townhouse during the final months of her life. Financial records documented payments to thugs and criminals who had carried out acts of intimidation against the Duke's enemies. Correspondence revealed the systematic nature of his campaign to destroy innocent women who had refused his advances or threatened his interests. Most damaging of all were detailed accounts of meetings where the Duke had coordinated with other powerful men to manipulate social and political situations for their mutual benefit, creating a conspiracy that extended far beyond individual acts of cruelty into systematic corruption of English society's fundamental institutions. The revelation of this evidence transformed the dynamic between father and daughter, shifting the balance of power in ways that neither had fully anticipated. The Duke found himself confronting not merely a daughter's rebellion but a carefully planned campaign of justice that threatened to expose decades of criminal activity and destroy not only his own reputation but the network of corrupt relationships that sustained the power of England's ruling class. Lady Vesper's voice, when she finally responded to her father's accusations, carried the authority of someone who held the power to destroy or preserve, to condemn or forgive. She detailed her discovery of her mother's letter and the systematic investigation that had followed, explaining how each piece of evidence had led to others until the full scope of the Duke's corruption had been revealed. Her tone remained respectful but firm, that of a prosecutor presenting an indictment rather than a daughter pleading for understanding. The Duke's response revealed the extent to which his own moral compass had been corrupted by years of unopposed power and systematic manipulation of others. Rather than expressing remorse for the suffering he had caused, he attempted to justify his actions by reference to the brutal realities of social and political competition, arguing that survival in their world required methods that more naive individuals might consider questionable. His defense revealed a man who had convinced himself that his crimes were merely strategic necessities rather than moral failures. This justification only strengthened Lady Vesper's resolve and clarified the righteousness of her cause. She had hoped, despite all evidence to the contrary, that confronting her father with the truth might prompt some expression of regret or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. His complete lack of remorse confirmed that he remained as dangerous as ever and that her campaign of justice needed to continue until his power to harm others was completely eliminated. The negotiation that followed revealed both combatants at their most formidable, each seeking to gain maximum advantage while concealing their own vulnerabilities. The Duke offered various forms of compromise, including financial settlements for his past victims and agreements to cease his most questionable activities in exchange for Lady Vesper's silence about his crimes. These offers demonstrated his failure to understand that her motivations went far beyond personal gain or family honor into questions of fundamental justice that could not be satisfied by monetary payments or promises of future good behavior. Lady Vesper's counterproposals revealed the extent of her strategic thinking and her commitment to comprehensive reform rather than mere personal satisfaction. She demanded not only full restitution for her father's victims, but also the systematic dismantling of the network of corruption that had enabled his crimes. Her conditions included the exposure of other powerful men who had participated in similar activities, the reform of institutions that had facilitated such behavior, and the creation of mechanisms to prevent future abuses of power. The Duke's refusal of these terms was inevitable, given that accepting them would have meant not only acknowledging his guilt but also betraying allies whose own secrets could destroy him if revealed. His rejection of Lady Vesper's demands marked the end of any possibility for negotiated settlement and the beginning of open warfare between two individuals whose strategic capabilities were evenly matched but whose moral positions were diametrically opposed. The final phase of their confrontation involved mutual threats and the revelation of previously hidden weapons that each had prepared for this moment. The Duke disclosed his knowledge of Lady Vesper's specific role in the destruction of Lords Pemberton and Thornfield, along with evidence that could be used to prosecute her for criminal conspiracy if he chose to involve legal authorities. His threats extended beyond personal consequences to include the systematic destruction of everyone who had assisted her campaign, from Lord Fitzwilliam to the various informants and allies who had provided crucial intelligence. Lady Vesper's response demonstrated that she had anticipated these threats and prepared countermeasures that would neutralize her father's advantages while maximizing the damage that his exposure would cause. She revealed that copies of all evidence against the Duke had been placed in secure locations with instructions for their release if anything happened to her or her allies. More importantly, she had identified and cultivated relationships with reform-minded members of Parliament and the press who were prepared to use the revelations about aristocratic corruption to advance their own political agendas. The stalemate that emerged from these mutual threats created a situation where neither father nor daughter could act against the other without risking their own destruction, but where continued coexistence had become impossible. The Duke understood that Lady Vesper's campaign would continue until his power was completely eliminated, while she recognized that her father would never cease his efforts to destroy her if given the opportunity. The solution that emerged from this impasse required both combatants to acknowledge that their conflict had grown beyond personal grievances into a struggle over the fundamental nature of English society itself. Lady Vesper's campaign had exposed the extent to which corruption and manipulation pervaded the highest levels of the social and political system, while the Duke's resistance demonstrated the willingness of entrenched power to employ any means necessary to preserve its advantages. The final confrontation between father and daughter took place not in the privacy of their drawing room but in the most public venue imaginable, the ballroom of Almack's Assembly Rooms during the most important social event of the season. Lady Vesper had chosen this location deliberately, understanding that whatever transpired would be witnessed by everyone whose opinion mattered in fashionable society, ensuring that the outcome could not be concealed or misrepresented. The Duke's arrival at the Assembly created an immediate sensation, as rumors about his involvement in various scandals had been circulating for weeks without official confirmation or denial. His appearance, perfectly composed and elegantly dressed as always, seemed designed to demonstrate that he remained unaffected by the whispers and speculation that surrounded him. Lady Vesper's entrance, carefully timed to occur after her father had positioned himself among his remaining allies, marked the beginning of the final act in their prolonged drama. Her beauty and composure drew every eye in the room, but the tension between father and daughter was palpable even to observers who had no knowledge of their private conflicts. The confrontation itself was conducted entirely through the language of social interaction, each gesture and word carrying meanings that were immediately understood by experienced observers of fashionable society. Lady Vesper's public acknowledgement of her father was perfectly correct but notably cold, while his response revealed a man struggling to maintain his composure in the face of challenge from an opponent whose capabilities he had finally learned to respect. The climax of their public confrontation came when Lady Vesper was asked to perform at the pianoforte, a request that she accepted with the gracious demeanor expected of an accomplished young lady. Her selection of musical pieces, however, carried messages that were clearly understood by everyone present. Her performance of airs from operas dealing with themes of justice, revenge, and the punishment of tyrants served as a public declaration of her intentions and a challenge to her father's authority that could not be ignored or misinterpreted. The Duke's response to this musical challenge marked the moment when their private war became public knowledge, transforming their personal conflict into a social phenomenon that would reshape the relationships and power structures of English high society. The great ballroom of Almack's had witnessed countless moments that defined the social hierarchy of English society, but never had it served as the stage for such a complete transformation of power as occurred during Lady Vesper's final confrontation with her father. The musical performance that had begun as a subtle challenge evolved into something approaching a public trial, with Lady Vesper serving simultaneously as prosecutor, judge, and executioner of a man whose influence had seemed unassailable only hours before. The Duke's attempt to respond to his daughter's musical challenge revealed the extent to which his confidence had been shaken by months of systematic attacks on his allies and interests. His request that she perform a different selection, delivered with the authoritative tone that had commanded obedience for decades, was met with polite but firm refusal that demonstrated to every observer that his paternal authority over Lady Vesper had been permanently severed. The silence that followed this public defiance lasted only seconds but felt eternal to everyone present, as the implications of what they were witnessing began to penetrate the consciousness of England's most influential citizens. Lady Vesper had not merely refused her father's request, she had publicly declared her independence from his control in a manner that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, but which now seemed inevitable given the events that had preceded this moment. Lady Vesper's next musical selection was even more pointed than her first, drawing from operatic works that dealt explicitly with themes of corruption exposed and justice triumphant. Her performance was technically flawless, but the emotional intensity she brought to the music transformed it from mere entertainment into something approaching prophecy. Every note seemed to resonate with meaning that extended far beyond the musical composition itself, creating an atmosphere of tension and anticipation that gripped every person in the assembly. When she finished playing, Lady Vesper rose from the pianoforte and moved to the center of the ballroom, where she began to speak in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the room despite its conversational tone. Her words, carefully chosen and precisely delivered, began with an expression of gratitude for the education and opportunities that her position in society had provided, but gradually evolved into something far more significant. She spoke of the responsibilities that accompanied privilege, the obligations that the powerful owed to those who depended upon their protection and guidance. Her language was perfectly appropriate for the venue and audience, never descending into accusation or inflammatory rhetoric, yet every sentence carried implications that were unmistakable to anyone familiar with recent events in their social circle. The Duke's face remained composed throughout his daughter's speech, but those who knew him well could detect signs of strain that revealed the effort required to maintain his facade of calm authority. His allies in the assembly began to distance themselves physically and emotionally, recognizing that association with him had become dangerous to their own positions and interests. Lady Vesper's revelation of specific evidence against her father was handled with such skill that it never seemed like an attack upon family honor, but rather like the reluctant testimony of someone whose conscience would not permit continued silence in the face of injustice. She detailed the systematic destruction of innocent women, the manipulation of business relationships for personal gain, and the corruption of charitable institutions that had been entrusted with society's most sacred responsibilities. Each revelation was supported by documentation that Lady Vesper had arranged to be distributed simultaneously throughout London society, ensuring that her accusations could not be dismissed as the emotional outbursts of an hysterical young woman. The evidence was presented with legal precision and devastating completeness, making denial impossible and defense futile. The Duke's final attempt to regain control of the situation involved an appeal to traditional notions of family loyalty and filial obedience, delivered with all the rhetorical skill that had made him one of Parliament's most formidable debaters. His words carried genuine emotion as he spoke of the pain caused by his daughter's betrayal and the damage that her accusations would inflict upon innocent family members and loyal servants. Lady Vesper's response demonstrated that she had anticipated this line of defense and prepared for it with the same thoroughness that had characterized every aspect of her campaign. She acknowledged the personal cost of her actions while explaining why considerations of family loyalty could not be permitted to override demands for justice. Her words revealed a woman who had counted the cost of her choices and accepted responsibility for their consequences, but who remained convinced that the principles at stake were more important than personal considerations. The climax of the confrontation came when Lord Fitzwilliam, whose newspapers had played such a crucial role in exposing the scandals surrounding Lords Pemberton and Thornfield, stepped forward to announce that additional revelations about aristocratic corruption would be published in the following day's editions. His statement made clear that Lady Vesper's campaign had grown beyond personal revenge into a comprehensive reform movement that would continue until the entire system of corruption had been exposed and dismantled. The Duke's realization that his daughter's actions were part of a larger conspiracy designed to transform English society, rather than merely to punish his individual crimes, marked the moment when his resistance finally collapsed. The network of allies and dependencies that had sustained his power for decades began to dissolve as former supporters recognized that association with him had become politically and socially impossible. The social ostracism that followed was swift and complete, more thorough even than what Lords Pemberton and Thornfield had experienced. Invitations were withdrawn, business relationships were terminated, and political alliances were quietly abandoned as the full implications of the Duke's exposure became apparent. The very efficiency of this process demonstrated how completely Lady Vesper had understood and manipulated the mechanisms that governed their society. The Duke's departure from Almack's that night marked the end of an era in English social and political history, though few of those present fully understood the significance of what they had witnessed. His carriage disappeared into the London fog carrying a man whose influence had extended throughout the British Empire, but who now found himself as powerless as any common criminal whose crimes had been exposed to public scrutiny. Lady Vesper remained at the assembly until its formal conclusion, accepting congratulations and expressions of support from former enemies of her father who now recognized her as a force for reform and justice. Her composure throughout these interactions revealed a woman who had been transformed by her experiences from a conventional product of aristocratic education into something far more dangerous and valuable to English society. The weeks that followed brought additional revelations as the network of corruption that the Duke had created began to unravel completely. Other powerful men found themselves exposed and ruined as their connections to his crimes became public knowledge. The reform movement that Lady Vesper had initiated gained momentum and support from unexpected quarters, including members of the royal family who recognized that the monarchy's survival depended upon distancing itself from the kind of corruption that her campaign had revealed. The Duke of Ravenscroft's final fate was exile rather than imprisonment, though the distinction was largely academic given the complete destruction of his reputation and influence. He departed England for the continent, where other disgraced aristocrats had found refuge from the consequences of their crimes, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the bitter knowledge that his own daughter had engineered his downfall. Lady Vesper inherited control of the family fortune and estates, but more importantly, she had established herself as a leader in the movement to reform English society and eliminate the kind of systematic corruption that had destroyed her mother and countless other innocent women. Her marriage to Lord Fitzwilliam, announced several months after her father's departure, was celebrated as the union of two people whose shared commitment to justice and reform promised to continue the work of social transformation that her campaign had begun. The final scene of this drama took place at Ravenscroft Manor, where Lady Vesper stood in the morning room where she had first discovered her mother's letter and begun her journey toward understanding the true nature of power and its responsibilities. The writing desk where Eleanor had hidden her desperate plea for justice now contained new documents, records of the institutions that Lady Vesper had established to help the victims of aristocratic abuse and to prevent future occurrences of the crimes that had motivated her campaign for revenge. As she looked out through the Georgian windows at the Derbyshire countryside that had been her childhood home, Lady Vesper reflected on the transformation that had occurred in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. She had begun this journey as a conventional product of aristocratic society, educated to be ornamental and obedient, but she had discovered within herself capabilities for strategic thinking and moral courage that had enabled her to challenge and ultimately defeat one of England's most powerful men. The price of victory had been higher than she had anticipated when she first read her mother's letter. Her relationship with her father, whatever its flaws, had been severed permanently. Her position in society, while ultimately strengthened, had been fundamentally altered in ways that would affect every aspect of her future life. Most importantly, she had learned truths about human nature and the exercise of power that could never be forgotten or ignored. Yet as she considered the women whose suffering had been avenged and the reforms that would prevent similar suffering in the future, Lady Vesper felt a satisfaction that transcended personal considerations. She had proven that even the most entrenched systems of corruption and abuse could be challenged and defeated by someone with sufficient intelligence, determination, and moral clarity. The letter she was writing to be placed alongside her mother's documents was addressed to future generations of women who might find themselves confronting similar challenges. Her words offered both warning and encouragement, detailing the methods she had employed while emphasizing that the ultimate weapon against corruption was not cunning or manipulation but the simple courage to speak truth in the face of power. Lady Vesper Ashford had destroyed a dynasty using lies, seduction, and silence, but she had built something far more valuable in its place, a legacy of justice and reform that would endure long after the crimes she had exposed were forgotten. Her mother's dreams of revenge had been fulfilled, but more importantly, her hopes for a better world had been given substance through her daughter's extraordinary campaign for justice. The afternoon light streaming through the morning room windows illuminated a woman who had found her purpose and fulfilled it, transforming herself from victim to victor and creating a new model for how power should be exercised in service of justice rather than personal advantage. The dynasty she had destroyed had been built upon fear and manipulation, but the legacy she was creating would be founded upon principles that could withstand any challenge because they were rooted in fundamental truths about human dignity and moral responsibility. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the grounds of Ravenscroft Manor, Lady Vesper completed her letter and sealed it with the family crest that now belonged to her alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to continue the work of reform, but tonight she could rest in the satisfaction of having honored her mother's memory and created a foundation for justice that would serve future generations of women who refused to accept that power and privilege granted the right to destroy innocent lives. The great house settled into silence around her, its rooms filled with the ghosts of past crimes but also with the promise of future redemption. Lady Vesper had learned to use the weapons of her enemies against them, but she had done so in service of principles that elevated her victory above mere revenge into something approaching divine justice. The story of how she destroyed a dynasty using lies, seduction, and silence had ended, but the story of what she would build in its place was just beginning.